In tonight's lecture, I want to talk about taxes and how to finance government, and especially the effect taxes have on individuals, on labor, and on the economy as a whole. First of all, we'll talk about taxes. Governments are financed through the uses of taxes, user charges, and borrowing. It's important not to forget borrowing. Governments are financed through taxes, fees that are levied, user charges, so user charges are charging someone a fee for doing something, like a toll to cross a bridge, and borrowing. Governments can borrow money by issuing treasury notes or government bonds or savings bonds or such to borrow money both from their own citizens, from citizens abroad, from companies, from anyone who wants to buy those bonds. Borrowing implies higher future taxes. So if a country is borrowing and going into debt, they know that that debt has to be paid eventually. If you borrow money to go to school and have student loans, you know that eventually that money has to be paid back. It's the same thing with governments. When they borrow money today, we know they have to pay that back in the future. Typically the way they pay that back is through taxation. So borrowing today means more and higher taxes in the future. The power to tax is a distinguishing characteristic of government. This is a distinguishing characteristic that typically only governments can levy a tax. Disney cannot tax you. Coca-Cola, Microsoft, and Apple cannot tax you. However, the city of Bowling Green, the state of Kentucky, and the U.S. federal government can all tax you. If we talk about the federal government, the U.S. federal government, the major sources of federal revenue are the personal income tax, which is about 46% of all federal revenue. That's the personal income tax, and the payroll tax. Now, the income tax and payroll tax are two different things, and we'll get into what that is. We'll show the difference between an income tax and a payroll tax. At the state, local regions, revenues are through sales tax. So in Kentucky, there's a 6% sales tax on things you buy. That money largely goes to the state of Kentucky. The payroll and income taxes largely go to the federal government in Washington, D.C. Other local taxes include what you pay on your car, user fees, that kind of stuff. The state of Kentucky also has an income tax, but it's not nearly as large as the federal income tax. So let's look at sources of government revenue. Here in blue we have federal government revenue. In 2012, personal income tax, the income tax that you pay, made up 46%, or just under half, of all of the money that the federal government brought in. This is the federal money the federal government uses to build roads, to pay soldiers in the military, to fund different projects. Payroll tax brings in another 34%. So together, payroll and income tax make up more than 3/4 of where the federal government gets its money. So more than 3/4 of all the money the federal government brings in is through taxes on income and payrolls. Corporate taxes on corporations make up about 10%, and everything else is about 7 or 8%. This is where the federal government gets funded. Now state and local, like cities, urban areas, the state of Kentucky. Federal government has some transfer payments of about 25%. Again, personal income taxes of about 11%. User charges like gasoline taxes, pay taxes to your car licensing, your pet licenses, that kind of thing. Property taxes on your home largely go to the state, a big chunk, 17%. Here's your sales taxes and excise taxes. An excise tax is a tax placed on a specific good. Like Kentucky has a 46-cent tax on every pack of cigarettes. We have a tax on every gallon of gasoline you buy. Every bottle of liquor has a sales tax. This is where state and local governments make up their money. So you see, the federal government is much more dependent on these payroll taxes. For the federal government specifically, where does the money come from? This is more updated as of 2015. It's from nationalpriorities.org, the National Priorities Project. 1.48 trillion in income taxes, 1.07 trillion in payroll taxes. The total for the U.S. federal budget in 2015, revenue brought in $3.2 trillion. $3.2 trillion brought into just the federal government in Washington, D.C. in 2015. That doesn't count the state of Kentucky, the city you live in, the county you live in, etc. Just the federal government tax revenue in 2015, roughly $3.2 trillion. So let's talk about the differences. Let's talk about the difference in a payroll tax and an income tax. Payroll taxes were first instituted in 1937 to pay for Social Security. Payroll taxes started paying for Social Security. Social Security is a program which funds payments in old age to people over 65. So this sends checks to people over 65. How do they send those checks? By placing payroll tax on people who are working today. They take that money from people who are working today and send it to those who are over 65 who have retired and are eligible to claim Social Security. In 1937, when this tax began and Social Security was invented, this tax was at 2%. Later in the 1950s, they expanded Social Security to not only include the old, but those who were disabled, and they doubled the tax rate to 4%. In 1965, we decided that those over 65, it wasn't enough to give them payments. They also needed health care and health insurance. We instituted Medicare. Medicare is health care for the elderly over 65, and we raised the tax to 6.25%. In the 1980s, as we see in the next 20 years, this payroll tax rate goes up and up and up. Until today, we sit at 15.3% for payroll taxes. That is split out several different ways. For instance, for Social Security, the worker who gets a paycheck is charged 6.2%, which you may see come out of your check as FICA, F-I-C-A taxes on your paycheck. So look on your paycheck for FICA taxes, and these are our payroll taxes. We also say that the employer has to pay 6.2% as well. But we talk about the real instance of a tax in economics, of who really pays these taxes. What it comes to find out is employers price this into what they know they're going to have to pay their workers, and they take it into effect. Otherwise, if they wouldn't have to pay this 6.5%, we know that employers could afford to pay their workers 6% more. This is making it 6% more expensive to hire someone. So total for Social Security and disability and Medicare and Medicaid, payroll taxes amount to about 15.3%. Here's the important thing to remember. Payroll taxes are paid by everyone at the very same rate. There are no deductions, there are no credits, there are no so-called loopholes. There is no escape from payroll taxes. Everyone pays them, and at the same rate. So does that mean we're charging the very youngest people who have just started their career, who are just working to build a family? Are we really taking 15.3% of their income to fund Social Security to fund people who are at the end of their career, who have worked for 20, 30, 40 years, who have had 40 years to save up and invest and save money in their career. Yes, in many cases we are charging the very poorest of workers, the very youngest and the very newest people in the workforce to fund programs that pay for those who are very wealthy, who have worked for their entire careers and have very high incomes. This is the opposite of the effect we want taxation to have. Remember, these are payroll taxes where the federal government gets about 1/3 of its entire income. Moving on, we look at the overall cost of government, and we say that $1 in taxes costs the economy more than an actual dollar. Number one, it's costly to administer, enforce, and comply with all these tax rules. The U.S. tax code is over 70,000 pages long. No one can be an expert in all of it. But we have an entire industry of H&R Block and Liberty Tax Service and accountants and tax lawyers and tax preparers who help both individuals and firms make sure they're paying their taxes correctly and accurately. It's an enormous deadweight loss. It's an enormous deadweight loss. These are very smart, very capable professionals who could be doing something other than just contributing to the tax system. This is an entire industry that could be much more productive than just helping us comply with 70,000 pages of tax law. Taxes also distort incentives and eliminate some productive activity. What we mean by that is this. Let's assume you enjoy going to the movies, but the government decides that movies are a bad idea and they place a 50% tax on your movie ticket. So now your ticket that was $10 becomes $15. The tax has made going to the movies very expensive. As we learn from supply and demand, when things get more expensive, we do less of it. If we made the movies more expensive, people would go to fewer movies. In the same way, this type of payroll and income tax makes what more expensive? If putting a tax on the movies means that fewer people go to movies, what does a tax on payroll result in less of? It results in less labor. It results in less people going to work or working fewer hours than they otherwise would. If we rewarded people more for going to work, I imagine they would work more. We hear the argument often that we need to tax things like cigarettes. Tax cigarettes more and people will quit smoking. If we raise the price of cigarettes, if we tax them enough, raise the price. Smoking is bad, we need people to stop. So raise the tax, they'll get more expensive and fewer people will stop. I agree completely. I expect that to happen, and it's what we tend to see. So if we raise the tax on working, what makes you think the same thing won't happen again? And in fact, that's exactly what we see. The higher we drive up costs on working, the fewer people do it. People would rather stay home, they work fewer hours, they take more vacation, they become less productive, and a less productive economy hurts everyone. That's what we call a dead weight loss. So the next thing we often hear people say is, since we don't want to hurt labor and young people and paychecks, let's tax corporations. Let's tax the big companies. We don't like them anyway. We think there's something a little shady. So let's tax corporations. Again, from the National Priorities Project, over time, we see that corporate tax rates only bring in about 10 to 11% of income. This has been the case since back in the 1980s. Corporate taxes bring in a very small amount of money compared to our individual taxes. Individual and payroll taxes bring in much more than any corporate tax. Why is that? We should just tax them more. Tax companies a lot more. Make them pay. Well, it's very difficult to do that because companies, like employers, can pass that fee along. What they'll do is, if you go to a company and say, we're going to make you pay this tax on this product you make, we're going to put a 10% tax on it. there's some sort of weird belief that the company will just go, oh, man, that 10% tax, well, I guess I'm just going to have to hand over all that money. I guess I won't get a bonus this year. That never happens. Of course it's not going to happen. What are they going to do with the 10% tax on the thing they make? They're going to charge 10% more for it. They simply raise the price by a certain amount, pay the tax, and their revenue stays the same. Corporations have the ability to pass these taxes along to consumers, and that's what they tend to do. For that reason, it's virtually impossible to raise corporate tax rates and earn an enormous amount of money off of it. We see here that the U.S. only makes about 11% of its income off of corporate taxes, even though we already have the highest corporate tax rate in the working world. Developed countries like Europe and the U.S. on average have a 24.8% corporate tax rate. Ours is 39%, higher than Japan, Germany, and any other developed country. We have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, and yet it only brings in about 10 or 11% of our income. Corporations tend to pass these taxes along to consumers with bad results. So if we look to raise tax rates then, income tax, unlike the payroll tax, is a graduated system. Income taxes are a progressive tax, meaning that the more you make, the higher your income tax rate goes. So for some workers who make very little, you might pay 0% of your overall tax in income taxes. Or your tax rate can go up to about 36% of your income. 36 to 39% of your income, depending on how high it is and where it comes from, can come from the income tax. And this is a graduated scale that goes up the more you make. Well, if we want to look and raise tax rates, here's our top individual tax rate over time. It used to be very, very high in the 1960s. Our top tax rate was up to 91%, and we brought in about 8% of our government revenues. As we lower the tax rate, our receipts as a percentage of GDP stay relatively stable. So higher tax rates on individuals don't seem to work. Charging a lot more in the income tax and raising and so-called taxing the rich more and more and more doesn't seem to work. Why not? Because if you begin to tax people at 50%, 70%, 90%, they stop working. It turns out that people don't want to go to work just to hand over 50 or 60 or 70% of their paycheck that they're never going to see. They'll simply stop going to work. And that's exactly what we saw when income rates were very high. Doctors would work only 6 months out of the year. Professionals like that would work only 6 months out of the year, spend the rest of the time at home and save the tax money. No one wants to go to work and only take home 70% of their earnings. So it turns out that this doesn't work very well at all. Here we look at the share of federal personal income taxes paid. And we say just tax the rich, that's what we can do. If we look at the latest year in 2010, the top 1% of income earners, pay 37.4% of the income taxes. Now keep in mind, this doesn't include payroll taxes. This is our 46% chunk out of the federal pie we looked at. The top 10% of income earners, the top 1/10 of income earners, pay 70% of the income taxes. The top 10% of income earners are paying 70% of the income taxes. And the top half of earners are paying virtually all of the personal income taxes. That means we have half of the people out there the bottom 50% of earners, half of our workers, are paying virtually no personal income tax. We see that again here. The highest quarter, the highest quintile of income taxes pay 23.2%. As a matter of fact, over time, this is the percentage of people who have no income tax liability. By 2010, that figure was up to 48%. So 48% of Americans have virtually no income tax liability. 48% pay virtually no income taxes. Remember, payroll taxes apply to everyone. Payroll taxes fund Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There's no getting out of them. There's no changes. They apply to virtually everyone. Income taxes are a completely separate thing. They're progressive from 0 to 36%, and 48%, or just under half of workers, don't pay any at all. They have virtually no tax liability. Mitt Romney was said to have effectively lost the 2012 election for saying this on camera. The problem was he's entirely 100% accurate. It's not popular to say, but it's entirely true. The numbers come from the IRS themselves. If we include transfer payments, the numbers get even worse. Transfer payments are payments that the government gives to people like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security. Here, our top quintile is paying virtually all of our income taxes. I work in the healthcare industry, and we're trained not to use that new term about healthcare. We call it the ACA. And here are the ACA plans. People want to know what type of taxes or what is included in the healthcare reform law. First of all, we have an increase in the Medicare tax. So our Medicare portion of the payroll tax, and the Medicare tax is applied to more types of income. The individual and employer mandates, where we make people have insurance, or we tell employers they have to carry insurance of a certain amount, adds up. We have begun taxing health insurance itself. So as part of the health reform, we placed a new tax on purchasing health care. In addition, if you buy very, very expensive health care plans, if you buy plans with a lot of coverage and low deductibles, we put a tax on those Cadillac plans, those high-end health insurance. Another way we fund healthcare reform is, like we say, we try to stick it to those companies, manufacturers and drug companies we don't like and we feel like they're bad people. It's okay to push them around a little bit. So we place fees on pharmaceutical companies, and we tax medical device manufacturers because we are afraid that people won't buy more of them. We think it's a good thing to tax, in the same way that we tax cigarettes because we know people are addicted to them. If we place the tax on cigarettes, we know they're going to keep buying the cigarettes. They're addicted. We can guarantee the government revenue. We're pretty certain that for medical devices, people need their pacemaker, they need their wheelchair, they need their walker. They're going to keep purchasing them. So we've placed a fee on medical device manufacturers. These are the taxes that fund our healthcare reform. So where is our government in the size of the economy compared to other countries? We saw the payroll taxes. We saw the $3.2 trillion that the U.S. brings in. How does that compare to other countries? Well, our government spending as a percentage of our entire economy, government spending as a percentage of GDP, is about 41.4%. In 2011, that was our government spending as a share of GDP. We're on the high side among many countries in the world. You see that many countries are much higher. Denmark, France, Belgium, and Greece. Greece, who virtually went bankrupt because of government spending and low taxes, was spending about half of their income. Sweden, Ireland, Germany, and the UK are all in the 40s. Who is lower than us? Japan is right there with us. Thailand, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, those sort of Asian tiger economies, are considerably lower. They have a much smaller government sector in relation to their GDP. They spend money on other services other than government. We see here 23 long-standing developed economies. Here's their growth rate, or how fast their GDP and their economy is growing, how much growth and expansion there is in their economy versus government expenditure as a proportion of GDP. So down here we're looking at these 60, 50, 40, 30, and 20% are here. And here we have growth rate. So what we see is the higher your government expenditures, the lower your growth rate tends to be. And the lower, the less money you spend on government, the higher your economy is growing. As a matter of fact, an increase in government spending of about 10% as a share of GDP reduces annual growth by about 1%. And this is because of these effects of taxation we talked about earlier. Taxation makes everything more expensive. It changes our behavior. And 2/3, over 75% actually, of federal spending is payroll taxes and income taxes. And what these do, what they make more expensive, is labor, is actual income. It discourages people from working. If you believe that making cigarettes more expensive will discourage people from smoking, it's only reasonable to say that making work and labor more expensive will discourage people from working more hours, from working more jobs, and from going to get a job in the first place. This is basic economics applied to labor and taxation and the deadweight cost of taxes. The 18th century Scottish philosopher, for some reason a lot of exceptional economists of the early days were Scottish, Alexander Tytler among them, and of course David Hume and Adam Smith first among them. But Tytler writes, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. Tytler was not a big believer in democracy. He said it can only exist until the voters discover they can vote themselves largesse, or they can discover they can vote themselves benefits and free stuff from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits. People always vote for the person who promises you the most free stuff, free school, free food, free health care, free everything, from the public treasury, with a result that a democracy will always collapse, is what Tytler says. He says that people will always vote to tax the other guy. They always want something for free. They'll always vote themselves benefits that they can get someone else to pay for, and from that point on, the democracy is finished. So far, in 200 years of U.S. experiment, this hasn't occurred. But there are many, many political philosophers who look at taxes and ask if this is the case. This is our short look at taxes and their effects and how this might affect the growth rate of an economy. Later on, we'll look at overall fiscal spending, taxes versus revenue, what a government brings in, and where that money goes. For now, let's talk about taxes and their effect on the economy, their deadweight loss, and the cost of taxes, and where these come from. Thank you.